Hello. We've spent weeks talking about the challenges at home, but this week provided a terrible reminder of problems abroad. So this morning, how can we help? Disaster and distress. The earth shook. Thousands of lives lost in Turkey and Syria. Moments of miracle among the dust. And glimpses of history this week too. Nearly a year into the conflict in Ukraine, President Zelensky surprised with a visit and a demand.
We have freedom, give us wings to protect it.
A smaller share of taxpayers' cash goes to help the rest of the world than before. We have one big question this week. What are our responsibilities beyond these shores? Andrew Mitchell, the Cabinet Minister who looks after aid for other countries, is here. I've been to Warsaw to speak to President Zelensky's closest ally, the Polish President Andrzej Duda, about the war. Labour's Lisa Nandy, who wants to level up our country, joins us from Nottingham. But it's Sunday morning and there's more to life than politics, so we'll talk to one of the nation's favourite cooks, Prue Leith, sorry Delia, on how to live happily, die well and learn to disagree. And to add to the mix, the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, Vadim Prystaiko, who hatched the secret plan for President Zelensky's visit, the AI expert, Priya Lakhani, and the SNP MP, John Nicholson, joins us too. Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone watching in the UK and on BBC World. Get a coffee and get ready because there is so much interesting stuff to talk about this morning. And I promise we will talk about some things to gladden the heart in the next 60 minutes. But first, let's have a look at the front pages. You can see there the main story on the BBC website, the Americans shooting down an unidentified object over Canada. The tabloids with a variety of stories this morning. The Mail with a story about pressure on the UK armed forces. And the Sunday Times splashing with a story about the chair of the BBC, Richard Sharp, who's been strongly criticised by a committee of MPs who've been looking into his links with Boris Johnson and how he got his important and influential job. John, let's start with that. You're a member of the committee that's been investigating this. The conclusions of the report are clear. They say they made significant errors and he failed to tell you some vital information. Should he resign, do you think?
Well, I think his position is extremely difficult. He's lost the trust of the BBC staff. That's very clear. I've been deluged with messages from BBC staff saying they don't see how he can head up the BBC anymore. And he broke the rules. The rules are very clear. When you sign up for that job application, you're asked if there's anything about your relationships with anybody that could cause embarrassment. This has clearly caused embarrassment. We knew he was a big Tory donor. We knew he'd given hundreds of thousands to the Conservative Party. But what he didn't tell us was that he'd facilitated an £800,000 loan for Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, who then gave him the job. It's all a bit Banana Republic.
Now, Richard Sharp has apologised for what he said went wrong, but he's denied some of the claims that have been made. But what do you think the consequences for this is if he stays?
Well, I hope very much that we will change the culture. Now, I do not think you should be able to give huge donations to a political party and then be rewarded by that political party with a plum job. And I hope very much that Keir Starmer now says that if he enters 10 Downing Street, will not appoint to plum public positions big Labour Party donors.
OK, we'll talk a bit more about that later. But Priya, you're an AI expert, and we'll talk about that a lot later in the show. But you also advise government, and you used to be on the board of the Department for Culture. What kind of distraction is it to have this kind of thing? I mean, you work in business. In business, would it just be easier if somebody just cleared off? What's your view?
I think just over the past few years, what we've seen is, as a member of the public here, I'm not speaking as a non-exec director of a government department, but there's been scandal after scandal after scandal. And the problem for me is that it erodes public trust in the system. So we really need to clean up politics, and we need to look at what cleaning up means to the general public. So, given that social media and news channels are absolutely filled with this, to me, with everything going on in the world, I just see it as a huge distraction. We need to focus on Ukraine, we need to focus on the earthquake, we need to focus on our economy, on our growth, which is flatlined. And so all of this is just a distraction. So personally, I think his position is pretty untenable now.
OK, well, let's focus on Ukraine then. Now, we all saw, Ambassador, the amazing pictures of Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to the UK. A huge surprise. How did you pull it off? I mean, how many people even knew it was going to happen?
A very limited number, that's for sure. Security was involved, that's one of the reasons, but another reason that we were working towards the result to the very end. So we wanted to have everything done before we will be able to announce.
And how many people? You said very limited. I mean, what are we talking? Fingers
A couple
of
of
one
people
hand?
here in London, that's for sure. A couple of people in other capitals.
Wow, so really
It was an operation, I have to tell you.
amazing. Were the French a bit unhappy that he popped up here? Because there had been rumours in EU circles that Zelensky was going to go to Brussels, he was going to go to Paris, and then all of a sudden he was in the UK.
What are you saying, that we did it on purpose? No, not at all.
But do you think that people do seek his attention? I mean, President Zelensky is an incredible leader by, I think, pretty much everybody's calculation, but also a real political celebrity. I mean, you could see MPs sort of falling over themselves to, get their selfies with him in the back of the shot.
I believe that he's enjoying it as a former media person. He's been in a movie of himself being a president before, so it's not the first time he is on TV, but obviously he's also enjoying it.
OK, we'll give plenty more time to talk to you three later in the programme, but thank you very much indeed for now. Now, it's been hard to stop watching the footage of the search for survivors in Turkey and northern Syria after the earthquake. More than 28,000 people have died that we know about, but we can see here live pictures from southern Turkey, and the search goes on, even though, of course, as time goes by, the chances of finding survivors does fade. But I want to show you what happened a bit earlier this morning. Amazing pictures, a British doctor there pulling another survivor out of the rubble after 5 days. Those are images of Dr. Malcolm Russell from a UK rescue team. Incredible to see that after all of this time. And countries around the world have been scrambling to help. And of course, the UK has too. When Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, he appointed Andrew Mitchell to the Foreign Office as the Minister for Aid. Even though he'd been plain, he was deeply unhappy about the Conservatives' decision to cut the proportion of our national income that the country sends abroad to help those in need. To quote him precisely, which we like to do on this programme, he said it was not right morally, not right politically, and against the law. Well, he's here this morning. Welcome to you, Minister.
Good morning.
First of all, what is the UK doing to help Turkey and northern Syria?
Well, as soon as this dreadful disaster struck at 1:17 in the morning on Monday, we got hold of the Turkish authorities to find out what we could do to help. And we've learnt a lot of lessons since the Haiti earthquake, when there was an international shambles of relief. It was much better coordinated this time. And what the Turkish authorities asked for was search and rescue expertise, sniffer dogs, and also for an emergency medical team to come. And we put them into theatre as soon as we possibly could. 77 expert firefighters from across 14 different forces with the state-of-the-art equipment to get people out from under the rubble.
So there's a big effort going on, but it gets more complicated when it comes to Syria. Now, the images we've seen from both countries are absolutely heartbreaking. We can see some of them here behind us this morning. It took 4 days for aid to arrive from the United Nations into Syria. Why? How do you explain that?
Well, there are 4 crossing points that the UN can use, and the UN is the major body to get aid across. Unfortunately, only one is open. That's because of the Russian veto at the United Nations. And that crossing point was damaged in the earthquake. But they got it open as fast as they could. There's one lane there available. And the UN got trucks in as soon as it could. And trucks have arrived significantly over the last 48 hours. But you're right that Syria is much more difficult than Turkey because it's ungoverned space there.
And to explain to our audience, it's a long time in a way since we've talked about President Assad in Syria, who is a dictator of a country where there has been conflict for many times, and many people believe he's had significant support from the Russians. Is the way that he is behaving costing life?
Well, we don't deal directly with him. We deal through the United Nations, and the senior Brit at the UN, Martin Griffiths, is on the ground in Turkey and Syria at the moment, making sure that aid gets through. But let me be clear, what Britain did was to get aid to the White Helmets, who were the civil defence group during the war in Syria. They were the first responders, pulling people out from under the rubble, and we got money through to them so that they could provide for support, put petrol in their cars, and get into action. And Britain was doing that right at the beginning.
But I know that you've followed this issue very closely for many years. Is the way that President Assad is behaving costing life?
Well, it's too early to say, because the significant support is coming through the UN there. And as I say, that is well coordinated. And the UN is in Damascus. The UN is able to deal with the Syrian authorities. And my information is, so far, that is working comparatively well.
What about sanctions? Because Syria has been under tough sanctions for a long time because of President Assad's activities. America has said, hold off some of the sanctions for now to help get relief in. Is the UK going to do that too?
Well, we will do everything we can to ensure that aid gets through to the people
Easing sanctions?
who are suffering. Well, the sanctions affect, for example, the ability to get money into the area. And we are finding ways all the time to achieve that successfully.
But would it be easier if you relax the sanctions? Because the United States has said they will ease off some sanctions. Is the UK going to follow that example?
Well, specifically here, where sanctions would hold us back in any way, we would seek to have them lifted. But at the moment, we are able to get what we want through, and that's the key thing. We're still at the stage where people are being pulled out of the rubble, as we've seen British firefighters pulling them out in Turkey, and that is the key thing we have to do at the moment.
But you may ease them as time goes on, you're suggesting, for these specific reasons, if needed. Okay. And this all, of course, happens in the context of how the UK and other countries help countries in need. Now, you were, as we know, as we heard, a very vocal critic of your party's decision to cut the proportion of GDP that we send to countries around the world. Do you still think that the government is balancing the books on the backs of the poor?
Well, we made a very strong case to Jeremy Hunt and the Treasury for increasing the support. And thanks to the additional money, £2,500 million spread across the next 2 years, we are actually spending more than the 0.5. We will return to the 0.7 as soon as the two fiscal tests laid down have been met.
But your view was that it was immoral to cut the proportion of GDP that the UK sent to other countries. Your view was that it was a mistake, and your view, these are your words, was that the government was trying to balance the books on the backs of the poor. Now, do you still believe that?
Well, collective responsibility, fortunately, is not retrospective. And I made clear what I thought at the time. But my job now is to try and make the system work as well as possible. And I am confident that when it comes to humanitarian support, where there is some flexibility in the budget,
and viewers
we
will
are
appreciate that,
doing our stuff.
But it does sound like that's still your view. You haven't changed your view, but your position now in the Cabinet stops you from saying it. Is that correct?
Well, I would put it a different way. I would say my position in the Cabinet now enables me to do everything from inside the tent to ensure that we work to good effect. And may I say that across government, this is working extremely well. The Ministry of Defence has been incredibly helpful. We got flights off the ground from RAF Bryce Norton yesterday with 4,000 thermal blankets, which are essential. And our stores in Dubai, we've got flights going from Dubai now into theatre to help in both Syria and in Turkey.
So there's really important work going on, and I'm sure the audience will be interested to hear about that this morning. But now you have that position inside government. Will you make the case? Can you say to our viewers this morning that when it comes to the next election, that the Conservatives will again commit to increasing the share of money that goes to foreign aid, to getting back to that 0.7% target?
Well, in respect of viewers today, I think it's important to say that the Disasters Emergency Committee appeal in the first 48 hours has raised £53 million, which is a remarkable tribute to people across Britain.
But I'm asking you about government money, Andrew Mitchell.
I'm coming to that. In these circumstances, Britain is always the country that goes first and in force and with effect to help people caught up in this desperate way. So let me make that clear. Britain is doing its stuff, both in terms of individual support and the government cohesive operation. In terms of the next election, we haven't yet done the details for the manifesto, but the position is this, that as soon as these two fiscal tests laid down by the government and accepted by Parliament, as soon as those two fiscal tests are met, then we will return to the 0.7. And as far as I'm concerned, that cannot come soon enough.
So you would like it to be in the manifesto, if it's possible?
Well, the position is very clear, that as soon as these two tests are met, then we will return to 0.7.
I think that's a yes, but you're not quite ready to say that. But let's move on, because there are other important issues we want to talk to you about. On Friday night, many of our viewers will have seen there were violent clashes outside a hotel on Merseyside in Knowsley that was accommodating asylum seekers. We can see those images now, and a police van was set alight, and there have been a number of arrests. What did you think when you saw those images?
Well, we live in a country where peaceful protest is part of our way of life, and I strongly support that. But violence in the way that we saw on Friday night is completely unacceptable, and the government condemn it absolutely.
There are accusations, though, that the government has created an environment where sometimes feeling against asylum seekers is stirred up. There have been accusations that sometimes that's been stirred up by government rhetoric. And also that sometimes when the Home Office sends asylum seekers to hotels around the country, they're not given proper support. The local community is not consulted and involved enough. Do you think the government bears any responsibility for these kinds of things?
Well, you say the government has set up an environment. The government has set up an environment where thousands and thousands of Ukrainian refugees have been received into this country. People coming equally from Hong Kong, people coming from Afghanistan. This is an unprecedented time in terms of Britain helping people who are caught in desperate jeopardy. And, you know, I have them in my own constituency in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, and we've been very welcoming. People in Sutton have been very welcoming, and that is the norm across the country, I think. But I want to make it absolutely clear that the violence we saw is completely unacceptable. The law will take its course, and totally unjustifiable as well.
But are you concerned, though, that there is something in the ether at the moment that appears to have been stirred up? You know, lots of local newspapers, local news programmes, local MPs often express concerns about how asylum seekers have been sent to their communities, sometimes without support, and sometimes that has stirred feelings up. Do you have any sympathy with that view?
Well, we have a duty to welcome these people. Often they are caught in desperate jeopardy. But equally, we have a duty to house them appropriately and to work with local people. Well, the Home Office is trying very hard now to stop the excessive use of hotels and find different ways of placing them in appropriate places in the community. And that is something that the Home Office will achieve.
OK, let's talk now about the chair of the BBC. We've just been talking to John Nicholson, the MP, about it, and we've heard how Richard Sharp made significant errors, according to a committee of MPs. Should he resign?
Well, I think that is a matter for the BBC. We've heard from this important committee in the House of Commons, led by a very senior and experienced chairman, temporary chairman at the moment, Damien Green. They have said what they have said. The Commissioner for Public Appointments, who has in fact recused himself from this particular inquiry, has said that the Commission will look carefully at the way this appointment took place. And I think we must wait for that, the result of that inquiry. But at the end of the day, this is a decision for the BBC now.
Well, it's not actually a decision for the BBC. This is a decision for the government. So let's just give people a reminder of what the Committee of MPs found. They found, it's there in black and white, that he made significant errors of judgment, and they believe that that has undermined public trust in the BBC. Now, the chair of the BBC is not an appointment for the BBC. It's an appointment that's made by the government, and according to the BBC Charter, it's somebody actually who can be only removed by the government. This is not up to the BBC, so what would the government do?
Well, I would dispute that point. First of all, the process is one for the government. The process took place. It's been reviewed by this senior select committee. They have said what they have said. The process is not complete. We have to wait now for the Commission on Public Appointments.
Why do we need another report? We've already got one. People know what happened.
We need to be fair to all parties in this, including Richard Sharp. So So I think we must wait for the result of the Commission on Public Appointments, and then actually the BBC is not a silent part of all of this. The board of the BBC will need to consider what is said and reach their own conclusions, and I'm sure that the government will react appropriately to that.
But the BBC doesn't have a mechanism to do this. I mean, I can read you, if you like, from the BBC Charter. It says that they have to resign by written notice to the Secretary of State, that's a member of the government, or if the appointment is terminated by order in council, and that's the Privy Council. This is up to the government, it's not up to the BBC.
I think that once everyone has seen what the Public Appointments Commission has to say, that it is inconceivable that the board of the BBC won't have a view.
And
the
what is your view? Should
will
you stay or go?
The government will. Well, I'm not in possession of all the facts yet. We need this inquiry to take place, but then, I think it will be a matter largely for the board of the BBC to make a recommendation to the government.
OK, Andrew Mitchell, thank you so much for coming in this morning. It's great to have you in the studio and speaking to you about so many different subjects. Right. Let's see what all our panellists think of that. They had strong views on it beforehand. John Nicholson, Andrew Mitchell says we have to be fair to all parties and fair to Richard Sharp to let this play out. It doesn't sound like the government really wants to touch this with a barge pole at the moment. What do you think?
Well, we were fair to Richard Sharp. We had him in for a couple of hours. We gave him an opportunity to say he'd got it wrong, to hold up his hands, to say he'd made a mistake. He refused to do so. And I'm afraid that Andrew Mitchell is entirely wrong, and you're completely correct. It's nothing to do with the BBC. The BBC can't force him out. The BBC didn't appoint him. Boris Johnson appointed him. Boris Johnson made him the BBC chair while he was arranging and facilitating an £800,000 loan.
Which, of course, he denies that he facilitated the loan, but he says that he put the two connected, a relative of Boris Johnson.
That is dancing on the head of a pin. If you facilitate a loan, apparently the Prime Minister couldn't get by on his £160,000 salary. He was struggling financially. And his cousin, some kind of cousin, distant cousin, comes along and offers to help. And Richard Sharp was the person who facilitated that.
I'm interested, Priya, in what you think of how the Minister handled that. You were clear, actually, that it was untenable because there's a distraction. You just need to crack on. Briefly, do you think it would be better, actually, if Richard Sharp just decided to go of his own accord?
Well, no, because on the one hand, what we're trying to do is say, let's clean up the process of appointments. So what you have to do, and I think to be fair to what I've seen across government, is you also then have to ensure you have a process for outgoing. And all they're saying, they're not making a decision. They're just saying, let's have the due process, right? Let's not cut it short. Let's hear from anyone. So I think if we're going to talk about process being clear, transparent, signing up to public principles, et cetera, and being very clear what that looks like in the future, then we've got to be fair to the entire process. And from hearing Andrew Mitchell, that's, I think, the position of the government is let's wait and hear for the rest of these.
Wait for what?
Reports.
What are they waiting for? There's a very detailed report. We've seen, I think, 3 or 4 Sunday Times investigations into that. What are ministers waiting for? What bit of information do they not have? The facts are abundantly clear. We know what the facts are. It's time to... There's a great thing that they do in government at the moment, which is they keep throwing things into the long grass, saying, we're waiting for an inquiry. I mean, how many inquiries do you need to determine the facts?
We will see it in the interest of transparency.
For example, with Nadine Zahawi, we saw a process. And again, I'm not the government, but I'm just saying that if you talk about a process, you need to ensure that that process is now... We have to create more clear and transparent, but it's allowed to play out, and that wasn't quite straight in the long grass.
Well, we will see how it plays out, and in the spirit of transparency, I should say, we asked Richard Sharp if he wanted to come on the programme this morning, but he declined.
Surprise, surprise.
Now, I want to talk about Ukraine. Ambassador, we talked a bit about President Zelensky's visit this week, which I think our viewers will remember seeing for such a long time. But when we've also seen these awful scenes in Turkey and Syria, as we approach the anniversary of the conflict, how do you keep what's happening in Ukraine in people's minds? And do you ever worry that actually it will slip away from people's consciousness?
To some extent, yes, because it's been already a year, and we understand how the dynamics in press and media around the globe is working, how people unfortunately have this another tragedy showing the previous tragedy. And it's not like we try to keep it on agenda. We'd love to be a boring European nation with nobody would invade and fight with us, but it's not happening so far. So what was much easier in this nation, because this nation is supporting. That's actually why Zelensky was here in the first place. So these people here, they understand what's happening, they understand the tragedy, they understand how can help. And this help, that's what we discuss, and that's why President Zelensky discussed with Rishi Sunak.
And do you feel that Western support is as solid and as united as it has been? We saw, for example, the discussion around tanks. We talked about it a lot here in the studio. Germany, for example, was obviously reluctant for a while, and then in the end there was a decision to go forward and send tanks to Ukraine. How difficult is it to keep that jigsaw together?
You're right. You know, when it's what's happening in Turkey is actually will of the God, very unfortunately. What is happening in Ukraine is the will of some personalities. And people understand that we unfortunately cannot avoid this tragedy with the earthquake, but we easily can avoid the wars and total destruction. So this is in the core of the problem, and I hope that leaders around the world understand that as well.
Okay, well, it's one thing, and when it comes to Ukraine, we've seen, drones and technology, even how the government in Ukraine has used social media so effectively. But artificial intelligence is also something that's becoming increasingly part of all of our lives. Priya, this is your world. When it comes to disasters like the earthquake, are there things that AI can already help with?
Absolutely. So if you look at sort of 3 areas to make it simple, right? So before any sort of natural disaster, actually, then during, and then afterwards. So if we're thinking about before, there are lots of people working on trying to predict an earthquake. So if you think about when in the fault line there's a rupture, there are waves, right? If you have sensors at the wave areas, and then those are basically speaking to seismologists' technologies, and then you're using pattern recognition of previous earthquakes, and this is occurring on cyclones, every single type of natural disaster that you can think of. But they're trying to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to try and predict when one might happen. Now, it is a really nascent field. We haven't had the best of results, and they've tried this in the past, particularly in California, where there are, there's lots and lots of different earthquakes, so they can try and measure that activity. The problem that we have is AI relies on lots of data. The data is about under 3 decades old, and so, but even giving a few seconds worth of warning can stop trains to avoid them from derailing, and you can turn off your gas to stop the explosions, which, for example, created the aftermath in San Francisco.
And those could make very big differences.
Absolutely.
But what about right now? So we're all watching what's happening there.
So think now about image recognition. So a lot of people are on ChatGPT and DALL-E, right? But if you think about AI and image recognition, imagine using satellite data, combining that with Google Maps, recognizing images of previously buildings that were there, the ones that have fallen, right? And then trying to basically, divert humanitarian aid into certain areas where there could be humans. Then imagine robots picking through the rubble, which is a lot safer, but even during the night, using infrared technology.
And is that happening right now? I mean, is that technology available now?
Yes, so we've seen robots being developed, and actually you can search for them and have a look at them, and it's absolutely incredible how this technology is being deployed. The AI and satellite, absolutely. Atlas AI is a company that then they opened up their data sets, and not only then during an earthquake are you able to use their imagery to say that was where a building was, but post an earthquake where buildings have been flattened, you can then use that data, and AI can help to model where should you reconstruct and how should you reconstruct. So it's about predicting, it's about being able to be more accurate with your decisions, it's about actually trying to, prevent loss of human life, and then you've got this sort of before and after in where it can be used. So, the more and more investment we have in these areas, there is AI for good, and it can absolutely be used for these sorts of purposes.
Very interesting, and to hear that it could be being used now. As you know, is it actually being used now, do you think, in a way, in this rescue effort?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the satellite imagery, image recognition, that is artificial intelligence. It's absolutely being used, and there's some extraordinary companies opening up their data sets to Turkey and Syria to allow that to happen. But closing social media channels, for example, isn't as helpful, because if you imagine all of that data, if you imagine sort of data where people are posting on channels where they need help, right, where there have been issues, scraping that data, understanding what's going on, combining that with mapping, with imagery, you could start to see that you can make your response even more targeted. So actually, the more data feeding into this system, the more information we're going to get on the ground.
And just finally, this is, I suppose, a yes or no answer if you can. I think when we talk about artificial intelligence, I think lots of us think, what's it really about? I mean, should we be scared of robots coming to take our jobs? These big sort of technology gremlins. Should we be scared, or is that just pathetic because we're not trying to understand the change that's in front of us?
I think there are always good actors and then there are bad actors. Actually, I'm super excited about all the good that it can create, and it's doing good. We just need to be better consumers of AI so we can ask the right questions.
It could be bad in the music industry, can't it? For example, in stealing copyright effectively. That's
I know
one
some
danger.
of the people you were bopping with at the Brits last night, John, might not be too happy about robots writing their songs.
You were spying on me, Laura.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for now, and more from you later. But we want to hear from you as well. I'd love to know if you have been using AI. What has ChatGPT done for you? Is it doing your kids' homework, or maybe yours? We will talk about this again, a huge change in our times, and we're going to speak to people at the forefront of this whole new world in the next few months. Email seems a bit old-fashioned, doesn't it? But please do get in touch that way, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or social media using the hashtag #BBCLauraK. Now, Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, is in Nottingham this morning. She'll be giving a speech at a local government conference in about half an hour, but I'm pleased to say she joins us first. Lisa, good morning to you. Knowsley is not far from your constituency. Now, we've all seen the pictures of the terrible events that took place there on Friday. What went through your mind when you saw those images?
I mean, it's just absolutely horrendous, but what I want your viewers to know most of all is that in the north of England, in places like Knowsley, this is not who we are. The story of the last decade has been the story of people across this country throwing open their homes to refugees from Ukraine, stepping up to support the Syrian appeal when we had the impending disaster. Even in the last few weeks, we've had people across the north of England stepping forward to put forward record donations to help with the appalling situation in Turkey and Syria. There are a small number of far-right activists who whip up hate and hostility in this country. We all need to speak with one voice when we say that we utterly condemn them. This is not who we are as a country, and they do not speak for people in Knowsley or for people across this country.
But more broadly, Lisa, are you concerned, though, about attitudes towards asylum seekers? Because we have seen asylum seekers being dispersed, which seems a terrible phrase, but dispersed and sent to live in communities around the country where there isn't enough support and those communities aren't always consulted. Do you have a broad concern about attitudes?
Well, it's worse than that, actually. The government contracts big companies to provide what they call asylum support. There is no support whatsoever. Instead, these companies maximise the profit that they make. They put people into some appalling accommodation without help or support, people who've been through hell and back before they even reached this country. And it's not only that they don't consult the community, they don't even inform the community that that's going to happen. It is a recipe for disaster. And when you lay onto that you've got a government that talks about things like an invasion in relation to immigration, you have a perfect storm, a really toxic mix that is being created. I think we could do far, far better. We could provide a properly structured, planned system of immigration that is aligned to skills shortages in this country. We could provide a welcoming and supportive system for people who are fleeing war and persecution and live up to our international obligations. And we could change the rhetoric around asylum so that we no longer have a Home Secretary that tries to blame the government's failings on some of the most vulnerable people in our country.
But is it
I think we
ever
could do
okay,
better, but we
in
can
your
only do that
view?
with a change of government.
Is it ever okay, in your view, though, to protest against asylum seekers in your constituency? I know some of your constituents in 2021 had complaints about asylum seekers being placed in a hotel in your constituency. It was an issue you raised too. Is it ever okay to protest?
It's absolutely right to say that we want a better and fairer system that supports people who come to this country fleeing war and persecution, but also takes into account the fact that often the system places people into accommodation that is totally unsuitable without even informing the local community. It's why I'm standing here in Nottingham today, where local government leaders are gathering from across the country, because people for a long time have been saying we want far more control, we want to take charge of our own destinies. Most people in this country, I think, are warm, welcoming, decent people who want to live up to our obligations to asylum seekers and provide support. And we could do it far, far better if we didn't have a government that was constantly micromanaging decisions from Westminster and Whitehall.
And I know, Lisa, you'll be making the case for giving those powers away today. You'll be promising local councils you'd give them lots more power. But on this particular issue, for whatever reason, should councils ever have a veto against having asylum seekers housed in their areas? Would you give them that power?
Well, I think they should have far greater powers over what happens in their communities. And I'll just give you an example that is directly relevant to what has been happening in Knowsley and the asylum system. When the Afghanistan crisis happened and the Taliban took control of Kabul, we had lots of people fleeing Afghanistan coming here to the UK. The government was completely unable to respond to that, but leaders across Greater Manchester, led by the Mayor Andy Burnham, worked together in order to respond and provide not just the accommodation, but the support as well, the medical care, the school places, all of the things that were needed. We didn't have any of the scenes that we've seen unfolding in Knowsley because we worked together, we planned together and we welcomed people together. We could do far better if we moved power out of Westminster and Whitehall and let communities take charge of their own destiny.
Now, you want to do that transfer of power, as you've argued just now, but would local councils actually far rather that you did something else, or maybe alongside, that you restored their budgets? Because since 2010, there's been a huge cut in real terms. Nearly 40% has gone from local council budgets. If you really want them to be able to do a better job and you really want them to take charge of their own destinies, would a Labour government restore their budgets?
Well, actually, I'm going to do something quite unusual on your show and agree with the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands when he said that it's time to end the dependency relationship, the begging bowl culture that has characterised the relationship between national and local government. We've released a dossier today that shows the absurdity of a situation where you've got ministers deciding who gets new picnic areas and park benches and setting up chewing gum task forces from Whitehall.
But would you give councils more funding
to drive growth?
But alongside those powers, would you give them more funding?
What we'll do is we'll end this absurd Hunger Games style competitive bidding process where we bid for small pots of money back, and we'll line up national government budgets behind local growth plans to get every part of our economy growing. So instead of wasting huge amounts of money from Whitehall on these small pots that are handed out ad hoc to whoever happens to be in favour on the day, we're going to make sure that every community has a local growth plan to grow their economy, get good jobs back into the community, money back into people's pockets and thriving town centres again. And we're going to do that by lining up the money that is currently wasted in Whitehall behind those local growth plans and moving power out of Westminster and Whitehall.
And finally this morning, Lisa, we've been discussing Richard Sharp, the BBC chair. Now, you'll know a committee of MPs has found that he made significant errors in the way in which he presented the account of him getting his job. Does Labour think that he should resign?
I think his position is increasingly untenable. There is a report that is due from the BBC, and I think it's right that the BBC is able to publish that report and that due process is followed. But I think this development today is incredibly serious. The government from day one has relied on the defence that Parliament pre-approved this appointment. This committee is now saying, had they known the full details and had that been disclosed to them about the relationship between Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party and the BBC chairman, that situation would have been very, very different. I think that does make his position increasingly untenable. And when the report is published, if those questions can't be answered, then I think that the integrity of the BBC is far more important than the position of one individual.
OK, Lisa, thank you so much. We'll let you go and get on with your speech, which I think you're about to give any moment now there in Nottingham. But thanks for being with us this morning. Thank you. And that story will, of course, move in the next few days. Now, at the start of the show, we said it's been one of those weeks when the reality of what's happening in the rest of the world was brought home. MPs filled the amazing Westminster Hall, as we've been talking about, to catch a glimpse and their own photos of Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, here with one powerful request.
And I appeal to you and the world with simple and yet most important words. Combat aircrafts for Ukraine, wings for freedom.
Now, after stopping off in the UK, President Zelensky headed to Paris and then Brussels, where he made sure to make time to speak to his closest ally throughout the war, the Polish President, Andrzej Duda. Just before that, I went to Warsaw to talk to President Duda about his friend and ally's request for jets. Should the West, nearly a year into the conflict, send its own fighter planes to Ukraine? Our interview with the President does contain some flashing images.
Samo męstwo, wspaniałe, niezwykłe męstwo, którym się wykazują.
It is incredible courage they are showing. It really deserves our deepest respect. This heroism the whole world is witnessing every day, seeing how Ukrainians are defending themselves against the Russian aggression. It is not enough, however, to defend themselves. What they need is to have modern and efficient equipment, armaments that will help Ukrainians to repel their aggressor. This weaponry has to be delivered to Ukraine all the time. Ukraine has to win, Ukraine has to repel the Russian aggression, but for it to be able to do so, it needs armaments.
Żeby mogła to zrobić, potrzebuje uzbrojenia.
But President Zelensky says now he needs jets. Why not send them? In fact, he says Poland has F-16s that you could send.
F-16 to są jedne z najbardziej
F-16s are one of the best jets in the world, so there is no doubt about how efficient they are. The problem from our point of view is a different one. First of all, we think that this requires a decision by the Allies anyway, which means that we have to make a joint decision. Also, due to the fact that there is a very serious need for maintenance of F-16s if they were to be deployed somewhere, it is not only about the jets. You also need maintenance and technical background, technical servicing, and so on and so forth. So it is not enough just to send a few planes, a few jets. And a problem that we're facing, at least in Poland, is as follows. We have such jets, but they are fewer than 50. So, as a matter of fact, this is our only stock of jets that we have. This poses a serious problem if we donate even a small part of them anywhere, because I don't hesitate to say we have not enough of these jets. We would need many more of them. A decision today to donate any kind of jets, any F-16s, to donate them outside Poland is a very serious decision, and it's not an easy one for us to take.
No jest decyzją bardzo poważną i nie jest dla nas decyzją łatwą.
It took Germany a long time to make up their mind about sending Leopard tanks. Do you feel frustrated ever that some of your allies have not been as proactive, have not been as quick to help, and have not been as generous as Poland has?
No, you cannot really talk about such things as being frustrated or not. A politician cannot be frustrated. I am doing what I believe is the right thing in the interest of the Polish people and from the point of view of the security of our part of Europe, and also the security of Ukraine. Because what is important to us is to make sure that a free, sovereign and independent Ukraine survives and exists. Also, what is important is that the Russian imperialism, which is reborn, be stopped, so that Russia hears a very strong and decisive no, so that Russia is repelled.
And what is your worst fear now? I mean, we already saw in November a missile come over into Poland that you believe was sent in error by Ukraine. But what was that moment like? Did you feel this could be it? This could be the beginning of your country being threatened in the way that Ukraine has?
Ja podszedłem do tamtej sprawy bardzo spokojnie.
I approached that event in a very calm way. Of course, I knew that the missiles fell down, but we also received information that they fell very close to the border. Initially, we heard there were 2 rockets, then it turned out that it was one rocket after all. They fell close to the border and they did not hit any military targets. So it was very probable indeed that they were not aimed at the spot where they crashed. But then it turned out that it was simply an accident. However, of course, we do fear that some kind of an act of aggression could be carried out, some kind of a provocation could be carried out against us, against Poland.
Wobec nas, wobec Polski.
We are now approaching the anniversary of the war. There are fears of a new offensive from Russia. What would your warning be to your allies? What would your warning be to the rest of Europe about what might be next?
First and foremost, you need to highlight that before the Russian aggression started against Ukraine, very many analytical documents which we received were saying that the war would not last longer than 72 hours, that Russia would be able to capture Ukraine within 72 hours. Nothing like that happened. On the 23rd of February, just a few hours before the Russian aggression started, I visited Kyiv, where I talked with President Volodymyr Zelensky. And when we said goodbye, Volodymyr told me, Andrzej, if Putin thinks that he would control Ukraine and that his army would enter and just take our land, then he's deeply mistaken. You're going to see Russians will not pass through, and he was right. The West has to support Ukraine today as strongly as it can, because Russian imperialism, neo-colonialism of Russia is really dangerous. Today it poses a threat to Ukraine. Tomorrow there will be the Baltic states, and then other countries will follow.
What would you say, though, to some of our viewers who might think maybe there should be a compromise? Maybe President Zelensky should find a way of finding a resolution, because or else the suffering might continue.
So already back then, when I addressed the United Nations for the first time, speaking at the General Assembly, I said the following: peace is possible only through law, only through the respect for international law. Respect of international law is the best guarantee of peace. As a matter of fact, then, if the war is to come to an end, if Russian aggression is to come to an end, that primacy of international law has to be restored. The international law has to prevail. International law guarantees peace and security. According to international law, Ukraine has to regain its territories which are internationally recognized. So as a matter of fact, Russians have to leave Ukrainian territories they occupied.
Rosjanie muszą opuścić okupowane tereny Ukrainy.
And what would you say as a leader to Vladimir Putin if he was here?
What would I say to Vladimir Putin? I would tell him that sooner or later it has to finish badly for him, because I believe that the world will be united. I believe that the world will remain on the side of honesty and justice, and honesty and justice is with Ukraine. If the world, if the free world, if the Western community, the Western democracies, NATO, the European Union, together with the United States, bound by our Atlantic ties, if they give permanent support to Ukraine, then Vladimir Putin has to lose. And sooner or later, it will mean he falls.
I just want to ask you about a couple of other issues. At the moment, in your country, an activist, Justyna Wojcicka, is being prosecuted and could be sent to prison for helping a woman get an abortion. Now, many of our viewers would find that very difficult to accept, very difficult to understand. Is that proportionate? Would you like to see the prosecutor drop those charges?
Madam, you're asking me, as I understand, about my personal views and opinions. I am Catholic, and of course, because of that, I am a very strong defender of life, and I am an opponent of abortion. So that is all I can say about this. Now, and of course, I have always been for life, for the protection of life, and I have never been hiding this.
But this is a question really about the law and how the law is used in your country. I absolutely respect your views on that. But is it proportionate that in this country, for the first time, an activist could be sent to jail?
In Poland, if we're speaking about the status, the legal status, the Constitutional Tribunal took a decision, it passed a ruling. So these are not laws which would have been passed by the Polish Parliament. The Constitutional Tribunal passed the judgment which repealed the provisions it considered were contrary to the Polish Constitution, because the Polish Constitution clearly stipulates protection of life.
Every economy around the world has been struggling to get back on its feet after COVID and all sorts of other challenges. And of course, the war in Ukraine has had a big effect. But now, by some measures, Poland's economy is in much better shape than the United Kingdom's economy. And at home, many people often think about Poles coming to the UK for work. Could it be that we might see British builders coming here instead of Polish plumbers coming to the UK?
No, dziękuję.
Thank you for your compliments about Poland. As the President of Poland, I am very grateful for them. I would like to send my greetings to all my compatriots who are living in the UK and working in the UK, working hard, because as the Brits know very well, Poles are capable of working diligently and honestly. They have demonstrated that over the past few decades in the UK. If things are so good, then I encourage all my compatriots to come to Poland, to come back home and to work here. But first and foremost, I am glad that Poland is represented there in the UK. I believe that my compatriots contribute well to the development of the United Kingdom, to building the British economy as an economy of success.
Mr. President, thank you so much for speaking to us today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was President Duda of Poland. I've always said we will keep talking about what's happening in Ukraine as time goes on. And as we approach the anniversary of the conflict, we will keep having that vital conversation. In a few minutes, we'll hear again from the Ukrainian ambassador. But let's turn first to something completely different and welcome a dame to the programme, Dame Prue Leith, no less. You don't need me to tell you. She's one of the country's most famous food critics and cooks, who's made chefs desperate to impress her over the years on Bake Off. But what you might not know is that Dame Prue has also been campaigning for many years on an issue that is hard to talk about. Some of the most important ones often are. Prue's campaigning to change the law so that people can end their lives with an assisted death. And she's made a new TV programme about this with her son, who's an MP, Danny Kruger, a Conservative who disagrees with her very strongly. Here's a clip.
Mum and I are waiting for Canada's leading assisted death practitioner, Dr. Stephanie Green, to assess Parkinson's patient Jan. She must decide if he qualifies for what Canada calls medical assistance in dying, or MAID for short.
All these words are so subjective, aren't they? Foreseeable and intolerable.
Exactly.
Intolerable for you might not be intolerable for me.
Exactly. There's a big responsibility on the doctor.
A very warm welcome to the programme, Prue. Thanks for being with us on a Sunday morning. Why do you feel so strongly about this issue?
I think I got into this when my elder brother died and he was cared for by the NHS. And it was the most horrible death. It went on for weeks and he was begging to be allowed to die and couldn't he have some more morphine? He was just in incredible pain. And I'm sorry to say that that still goes on. In any hospital where, especially with geriatric wards, you know, it's a kind of secret. The medical profession don't want to talk about it. Nobody likes to talk about how horrible death can be. And, you know, I don't say it's brushed under the carpet, but it's interesting that nurses are more in favor of assisted dying than doctors are. And I think that's because nurses are the ones who have to see it happening day after day.
Your son, though, and many of our viewers watching this morning will just take a view, and many people feel it in their guts, that it's just wrong to end any life earlier than it otherwise would take place naturally. What would you say to people? We see your conversations in the programme with Danny, but what would you say to our viewers who feel that?
Well, I think that is a sort of instinctive thing, that you don't want to end a life. And yes, that's fine. But actually, the person whose life, I mean, anyone can have a principled objection to assisted dying, but I think nobody's taking any notice of the people who are dying. If you're terminally ill and in enormous pain, all this talk of sanctity of life is a sort of mockery. I mean, it's your life. And if you're hating it and you're desperately want the pain to stop. I mean, I'm very conscious that I have had a wonderful life. I've had a fantastic life. I don't want to end it with 3 weeks or 3 months of enormous pain and misery, not just for me, but for my family and for everybody around me. I think it's my life anyway. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't believe in the sanctity of human life in that religious way.
But many people do, and they also have real reservations about how changing the law could potentially be exploited or abused, or people who are very vulnerable.
Nobody is asking anyone who disagrees with the widening or with the idea of adopting an assisted dying law. Nobody's forcing anybody to take it. It's an option. What we're asking is for people to have the choice. I'm not asking anyone who has principles that prevent them wanting to end their lives. Of course, they don't have to. You know, this is a very unfair debate. People who oppose this want to oppose it for everybody. People who want to have the law changed are perfectly happy that anybody who doesn't want it doesn't have to have it. We're not talking about sort of compulsory euthanasia here.
It's a very sensitive subject, and you broach it in this programme with your son very honestly, and some of those conversations are quite difficult. Do you think you will ever be able to persuade him that your argument is the right one?
No, I don't think I will. I think he is very principled and he doesn't agree with it. And he's very nervous about all sorts of what I think is sort of imagined slippery slopes, that we'll pass this law and then the next second we'll make it okay. You know, what we're asking for is a law that allows people who are terminally ill and people who are dying anyway to just make that death quicker and easier and not prolonged and agonizing. We're not talking about people with mental illness and so on. He's frightened that once we've got one law, we will expand it. But that has never happened in any country. Nobody has ever expanded their laws, and except perhaps Canada, but that's a very funny special case, because what happened was that the courts in Canada instructed their parliament to pass quite a wide law, which was based on unbearable suffering rather than on terminal illness. And they didn't do that. They passed one just on terminal illness, and then this was challenged in the courts, and they had to go back to what they were originally meant to do.
Okay, Dame Prue, I think we're going to leave it there. We've got some problems with your line, but it's been fascinating to talk to you about that this morning. And the programme is on Channel 4 on Thursday night, where you and your son have this very difficult conversation, but in a very sensitive and interesting way. We're grateful for your time this morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Now we are nearly at 10 o'clock. We've talked about so many different things this morning. Ambassador, I'd just like to pick up with you on what President Duda, your Polish ally, said. He was pretty clear that despite President Zelensky's very strong requests for fighter jets to help in the war effort, it's not going to happen. Were you disappointed to hear that?
No, let's wait and see. That's what we heard about tanks. That's what we heard about long-reaching artillery. That we heard about everything. I know that some leaders have to say these words for the sake of the unity of the alliance. I'm not saying that somebody is trying to, downplay it. No, they're just trying to create a compromise among all of them and come with some sort of group decision.
So you think it might happen, John? Should the UK and other countries send jets to Ukraine?
Yes, I think Ukraine has the right to defend itself. It's interesting we're talking about tanks, isn't it? Because remember, Boris Johnson popped up at the Defence Select Committee and said that tanks were no longer necessary for current defence needs.
Many nations believe.
Thank goodness you didn't listen to him, because they've been absolutely vital for your struggle. And of course we should defend Ukraine.
Well, a lot of things have changed in the last couple of years. Priya, something that's changing very fast is the world of artificial intelligence. Yeah. To leave us on a happy note, as we like to do on a Sunday morning, can you tell us one positive thing that AI can do to change our lives for the better in the next year?
I have to say, it's in education. It's the field that we've been working on, and it's about no more one size fits all, Laura. It's about personalised education, using artificial intelligence to make interventions. And the reason why it's so important, and you asked in the next year, is we can solve a lot of lost learning. You go to like Shiling Collegiate Academy, Streetley Academy, these are schools in the Midlands, in the country. You ask them, how have they been using AI way before ChatGPT? And actually they will tell you that's how they're using it. And so it's really just trying to now, cover those learning losses that we experienced over the last 3 years, increase social mobility. I do think the education is the answer to a lot of our issues.
So it's more than just
And
the
so
end
that's
of
the
homework
space.
then.
Oh my goodness, so much more. AI is so much more complicated than cheating on your homework. But yes, if you think that your children aren't using ChatGPT to inspire their homework, you are living on a cloud.
Oh dear. Okay, well, thank you for sharing some of your stories and insight about AI this morning, and we will be talking about it a lot more on the programme. I think we'll all be talking about AI a lot more in the years to come. Thank you, all three of you, so much this morning. As we've been on air, as we've talked about, rescuers in Turkey and Syria are carrying on the search for survivors. This is what's happening live right now in Turkey. It may be an increasingly forlorn task after days in the rubble, but there are still some glimpses of hope. In Ukraine, people face the prospect of an offensive of some kind to mark the anniversary of the war in the most terrible way. And we've spent a lot of time in the last couple of months in this studio talking about all the difficulties in this country. But this week may be a pause to remember right now the challenges in so many different places around the world and how complicated things are for politicians. As the Polish president told us, he wants to help, but sending jets is not straightforward. And we heard Andrew Mitchell, the cabinet minister, who clearly, personally, would like the aid budget to be higher, but he was just about walking the party line in our interview. A handy reminder that politicians aren't perfect, but their jobs aren't easy either. Now, as ever, you can catch up with our political leaders on iPlayer from the last few weeks. We've spoken to Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, Nicola Sturgeon and the Lib Dem leader Ed Davey. They're all there for you to have a look again if you fancy it. Next week, we'll be talking to one of President Biden's team and a Hollywood megastar. Stick it in your diary. I'm not going to tell you who yet, but I hope to see you then. Goodbye.